He didn't say a word when he walked in. He just set the folder on the edge of her hospital bed, right next to the IV line, and said, "I need you to sign these before the end of the day." Vivienne Okafor had been awake for 31 hours. Her back still ached from the epidural. Her hands were shaking in that strange hollow way they do after your body has done something enormous and your mind hasn't caught up yet. And her husband, the man she had driven through a snowstorm to marry 7 years ago, the man who cried at their first dog's vet appointment, was standing in his good coat, the charcoal one he only wore to board meetings, holding a pen out to her like she was a client who had run out of time. "What is this?" she said. Not a question, she already knew. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," said Donovan Marsh. The folder sat open. At the top, in clean legal font, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." Vivienne looked at it. Then she looked at her daughter, asleep in the bassinet 2 feet away, her tiny mouth working at nothing, her fists curled like she was already preparing for a fight. Rosalie, 4 hours old, 5 pounds 11 ounces, the most real thing Vivienne had ever seen in her life. She closed the folder. "Get out of my room," she said. Donovan didn't move right away. He had that look she'd come to recognize over the last year, the carefully managed patience of a man who had already decided the outcome of a conversation and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "Vivienne, I just gave birth," she said. "I just gave birth to your daughter, and you brought a lawyer's folder into this room." She said it quietly because Rosalie was sleeping, but quiet does not mean small. "So I'm going to say it one more time. Get out." He left, but he left the folder. She had met Donovan Marsh at a fundraiser in Ottawa, the kind of event where everyone is wearing a blazer over something casual to prove they're serious but not stiff. He was a partner at Hargrove Capital by then, 34 years old, the kind of man who makes a room recalibrate when he enters it, not because he's loud. Vivienne had always been drawn to certainty. She'd spent her whole childhood in a house where nothing was certain, where her mother's moods changed the weather, and her father spent most evenings in the garage. And Donovan seemed like the opposite of all that. She was 31. She ran the estates division at Callaway & Price, a mid-sized firm in the market for serious lawyers, and she was by then a serious lawyer. Real property, land trusts, inheritance disputes, the kind of work that required patience and precision, and an ability to sit with complexity. She was good at it. She had been good at it since articling, when her supervisor told her she had an unusual talent for seeing the whole picture. She saw the whole picture with Donovan, too, eventually. Just not soon enough. They married 2 years after the fundraiser, in a small ceremony outside Kingston, with her sister Margot as maid of honor and his brother as best man. Vivienne wore her grandmother's pearl earrings. Donovan cried during the vows, just a little, just enough that she thought, "This man has a soft center he doesn't show many people, and I get to be one of the ones who sees it." She was wrong about that too. The cracks didn't show all at once. They rarely do. They showed the way water damage shows. First, just a shadow on the ceiling, something you tell yourself is nothing. And then, one morning you wake up, and there's a stain the size of a dinner plate, and you realize it's been spreading for months. He started working later. He started taking his phone to the other room. He started responding to her with the kind of attentiveness that is actually its opposite, nodding at the right moments, saying, in the right places, present in body only. She told herself it was stress. Hargrove Capital had gone through a difficult restructuring. He was under pressure. Then she got pregnant, and she actually thought, that it would reset something between them. She knew, even as she thought it, that this was magical thinking. That a baby is not a reset button, that you cannot grow a person inside you and hope it fixes the person beside you. She knew this, and she hoped anyway. The pregnancy was hard. She had severe morning sickness well into the second trimester, the kind that had her gripping the sides of the toilet at 6 in the morning while Donovan slept. He was helpful for a while. He bought ginger chews from 3 different stores. He rubbed her back on the bad nights. But by month 5, something in him had shifted again. A coolness, a distance, like a tide going out, so slowly you don't notice. The shore is bare until you're standing on wet sand wondering where the water went. At 6 months, she found the credit card statement. She wasn't snooping. That needs to be said because it matters. She was going through the household files looking for their property tax assessment. They owned the land the house stood on, a parcel of just under 40 acres outside of Marital, that had come to her as part of her grandmother's estate, carefully documented, legally airtight, and the statement slipped out of a folder. Hotel receipts, restaurants she had never been to, a weekend in Montreal she hadn't known about. She sat on the floor of the home office for a long time, the paper in her hands. Then she put it back, went upstairs, and lay in bed listening to her daughter kick. She didn't say anything to Donovan, not yet. She called her friend Beatrix Ossie the next morning, Bea, who had been a family law barrister for 12 years, and who had, on more than one occasion, helped Vivienne understand the legal landscape of a situation before she walked into it, and she said, "I need to ask you something hypothetical." Bea listened. Then she said, "That's not a hypothetical, Viv. I know. What do you want to do?" Vivienne thought about Rosalie, already named, already real to her in ways she couldn't explain. She thought about the land in Marital, 40 acres, the farmhouse her grandmother had built, the maple trees along the north fence that had been there since before her mother was born. She thought about what it meant to own something that predated your marriage and would outlast it. "I want to be ready," she said. Bea helped her understand what ready looked like. She didn't go back to work after the birth. She wasn't supposed to for 12 weeks anyway. She had EI, she had the firm's parental top-up, she had a plan. What she hadn't planned for was lying in a hospital bed at 2 in the morning with her daughter asleep on her chest and a dissolution petition sitting on the bedside table. The night nurse, a woman named Glenda, who had the particular calm of someone who has seen everything and is startled by nothing, came in at 3 to check Rosalie's weight. She saw the folder. She looked at Vivienne. "You okay, Anne?" "I'm a lawyer," Vivienne said. It wasn't an answer, but it was the truest thing she had available. Glenda nodded slowly. "You want me to call anyone?" "No," she said. "Thank you." She picked up the folder after Glenda left. She read through it, all of it carefully, the way she would read any legal document, which is to say she read what was there and she read what was absent. The petition listed shared marital assets. The Toronto condo they'd bought together 4 years ago, the joint accounts, the investments under both names. It was thorough. It had clearly been prepared by someone competent. What it did not list anywhere was the land, the 40 acres in Marital, the farmhouse, the maple trees, because it wasn't his. It had never been his. It was hers, held in a trust established by her grandmother's estate, before Vivienne was married, registered in her name alone, never commingled, never used as collateral for anything joint. She had been meticulous about that. Her grandmother had been meticulous about that. 3 generations of women in her family had understood something about keeping what is yours in your own name, and Vivienne had absorbed that lesson early. Donovan apparently had never fully understood the difference between what we share and what is mine. She set the folder down. She looked at her daughter's sleeping face, the extraordinary smallness of her nose, the way her eyelids had the thinnest tracery of veins, like a leaf held up to light. "Okay," Vivienne said softly, to Rosalie, to herself, to the room. "Okay." Donovan came back the next morning. He brought coffee, a flat white from the place on Bank Street that she used to love, and set it on the table like a peace offering, or maybe like a bargaining chip. With Donovan, the line between those two things had always been thin. "I want to talk," he said. "You've been in contact with a woman named Petra Calendar," Vivienne said. She had spent part of the night making quiet phone calls. Bea had helped. For approximately 14 months. He was quiet for a long moment. "Vivienne, I'm not asking you to explain. I'm telling you what I know." She could see him recalibrating. The charcoal coat again, the carefully managed expression. "The petition is fair," he said, finally. "I had Gordon Price look it over. Gordon Price has been my opposing counsel on 4 files in the last 2 years, she said. "That's an interesting choice. It's not a conflict. You're not his client, no," she said. "I'm not," she paused. "Donovan, the petition doesn't include the Marital property." He looked at her. "That's always been in your name." "Yes, it has." She let that sit. Something moved across his face. Not guilt. She'd stopped expecting guilt some months ago. Something more like calculation. Like a man adding up numbers and arriving at a total he wasn't expecting. "What are you saying?" he said. "I'm saying that I've read the petition, and I'll have my own counsel review it, and we'll proceed from there." She picked up the flat white. "You can go now." She was in hospital for 2 more days. Standard for a first delivery with a minor complication. Rosalie had needed some observation. Her oxygen levels dipping briefly in the first hour, enough to require monitoring, but not enough to cause lasting worry. Still, Vivienne didn't sleep much. Not because of fear, but because she didn't want to. She wanted to be awake for it. She wanted to watch her daughter breathe. Her sister Margot arrived on the second afternoon, with a bag full of things Vivienne hadn't known she needed. Good tea, the softest socks she'd ever felt, a wool blanket from the house, and a small framed photo of their grandmother, standing outside the farmhouse in Marital, squinting into the sun with her arms crossed, looking like a woman who owned the ground she stood on, because she had. And then she had given it to Vivienne. Margot sat in the chair by the window and held Rosalie with the careful reverence of a new aunt, and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "He actually came here. With paperwork, I cannot." Margot stopped, started again. "What are you going to do?" "I've already called Bia. I'm retaining her formally as of tomorrow. What about the land?" Margot looked at her. "Does he know?" "He knows it's in my name. I don't think he knows what that means for him." Vivienne adjusted Rosalie's blanket. "He married a property lawyer. I've always thought he didn't quite understand what that meant." Margot looked out the window. Outside, the Ottawa River was pewter gray under a November sky. The kind of cold that has no drama to it, just permanence. "Gran would have something to say about this," Margot said. She would. Vivienne smoothed the edge of the blanket. She would say, "A man can leave, Vivienne. The land stays." She went home on a Thursday. The house, the Toronto condo they'd shared, felt strange without Donovan in it, and then she realized it felt strange with all of his things still in it. His coat on the hook, his coffee pods in the cupboard, the framed print in the hallway they'd argued about for a month before she admitted it looked fine. She didn't ask him to leave. Not yet. She didn't have the energy, and she didn't need to fight on every front at once. She set up the nursery, fed Rosalie at 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. and 7 a.m. And when Donovan came home late, she was already in bed, and when he left early, she was already feeding the baby, and they moved around each other like planets in very different orbits, close enough to see, but not close enough to touch. He texted her once in that first week. "Gordon says we should be able to finalize this by March if you cooperate." Cooperate was an interesting word choice. She filed it. She called Bia. "I'm ready to move." Bea had been thorough in the way Vivienne had learned to be thorough. Not aggressive, but complete. The land trust was airtight. Established before the marriage, never touched by joint finances, never listed as marital property in any agreement. Under Ontario family law, property brought into a marriage and kept separate is generally excluded from equalization. Vivienne had done this right, all of it, without ever fully letting herself believe she was doing it for this reason. Donovan's lawyers will likely argue the farmhouse benefited from marital funds. Bia said over the phone. "It didn't. I had it re-roofed 3 years ago with money from my grandmother's life insurance. I have the paper trail." Bia was quiet for a moment. "You've been keeping records." "I keep records of everything. I'm a property lawyer." "Right." Another pause. "Viv, this is going to go in your favor. But I want you to be prepared. It won't feel good. Even when it goes your way, I know. And the land, what are you going to do with it?" Vivienne thought about the maple trees. The way the north fence looked in October, the leaves so red they seemed to be on fire. Her grandmother hanging laundry behind the farmhouse, telling Vivienne that the most important thing a woman could own was something no one could take from her in the middle of the night. "I'm going to build something there," Vivienne said. "Eventually. When Rosalie is old enough to understand what it means." The mediation happened in February. Donovan came with Gordon Price, who greeted Vivienne with the very particular awkwardness of a man who has known someone socially and now finds himself on the wrong side of a professional divide. Vivienne came with Bia, who had a gift for seeming entirely relaxed while being entirely prepared. It took 4 hours. Donovan's position going in was that the equalization calculation should include the Manatic property's appreciated value. He had clearly been advised that there was at least an argument to be made. Bia dismantled it methodically. The trust documents, the insurance payout paper trail, the fact that not a single dollar of joint money had ever touched that land. Gordon shifted in his chair at one point and said, "We're prepared to litigate this if necessary." Gordon, Bea said pleasantly, you would lose. And you know you would lose. And I know you would lose. So let's talk about what your client actually has a claim to. What Donovan actually had a claim to was his half of the condo's appreciated value, his portion of the joint accounts, and his share of the investment portfolio. Not nothing, but not close to what he'd apparently been hoping for. Vivienne watched him sign the final agreement. She watched his face while he signed it, not with satisfaction, exactly. With something quieter, the feeling of a thing having finally settled into its correct position, like a key turning in a lock. They were in the elevator together afterward, just the two of them, which was an accident of timing and not a choice either of them would have made. Donovan stared at the doors. I didn't think you'd fight, he said. Vivienne looked at the number above the door climbing down. 4, 3, 2, I know, she said, that was always your mistake. Spring came the way it comes to Ottawa, reluctantly, and then all at once. The snow went gray before it went, and then one morning Vivienne woke up, and the trees along the street were actually, undeniably, green. Rosalie was 4 months old. She had, in those 4 months, developed opinions about things. She preferred the purple Souther to the green one. She found ceiling fans riveting. She had a very specific scream she deployed when set down too soon, and a separate, lower register fuss she used when she was just tired and wanted someone to hold her. Vivienne was learning to read her the way she learned to read complex documents. Carefully, with full attention, looking for what wasn't obvious, she took Rosalie to Manitic in April, the first warm weekend. She drove the 2 hours with the window cracked and the radio low and Rosalie asleep in the car seat. And when they turned down the gravel lane to the farmhouse, the maple trees were just starting to leaf. That first tender green that seems almost impossible, like the color is too fragile to survive. The farmhouse needed work. It always needed work. There was a section of fence on the east side that had been leaning since fall, and the porch step had a soft spot she kept meaning to address. But it was solid in the way that things built carefully and maintained faithfully are solid. It would stand for another 100 years if she let it. She walked around the property with Rosalie in the carrier, the baby's warm weight against her chest, and she told her about it. About great-great-grandmother coming to Canada with 2 suitcases and a land grant. About her grandmother building the farmhouse with her husband, and then, after he died, running the farm herself for 30 years. About how the land had passed, daughter to daughter, held in trust and kept whole, because her grandmother had understood something fundamental. That some things must be protected, not because they are precious in the way jewelry is precious, but because they are yours in the way your own name is yours. Rosalie listened, with the slightly cross expression of a baby being carried on a chilly April morning. Then she grabbed a fistful of Vivienne's jacket and held on. Yeah, Vivienne said. Exactly. B called in May with the finalized paperwork. Everything registered, everything recorded, everything in order. Vivienne sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and listened and said okay and good and thank you, Bea, seriously. And then she sat for a long time after she hung up, the tea going cold. She thought about the moment in the hospital room. The folder on the edge of the bed, Donovan in his good coat, her daughter 4 hours old and still working out how to exist in the world. She thought about what she had felt in that moment. Not what she'd shown, but what she'd actually felt. And she could say now, with the distance of months, that underneath the shock and the grief and the particular cold fury of a woman betrayed at the absolute worst possible time, there had been something else. Something she could only call readiness. Not because she had been waiting for this, because she had spent 7 years building a life that could survive it. She hadn't planned it that way, but there it was. She went back to work in June on a graduated return that had been arranged before everything happened. The firm had been genuinely kind. Her supervising partner had sent flowers to the hospital and asked nothing of her until she was ready. She came back 3 days a week. At first, Rosalie at the daycare, 2 blocks from the office, and the work felt different. Not harder, just differently weighted. When you sat with a client going through an estate dispute, knowing that their grief and their money were completely tangled together, and that they needed someone who could hold both things steady, it helped to know that you had held both things steady yourself. Margot came for a visit in July, and they drove out to Manitic on a Saturday, the 3 of them, and fixed the porch step together, while Rosalie observed from a blanket in the grass with what appeared to be critical interest. "She looks like Gran," Margot said. Vivienne looked at her daughter, the eyes dark and direct and somehow already considering. "Yeah," she said, "she does." They ate dinner on the porch as the sun went down over the north fence, the maple trees casting long shadows across the yard. The light that evening was the color of old honey, the kind of light that makes everything look like it has already become a memory. Vivienne thought about what she would tell Rosalie about this year when she was old enough to understand it, not the whole story at once. There was no need to hand a child the full weight of adult failure before she was ready for it. But piece by piece, as the questions came, she would tell her that her grandmother's grandmother had come here with nothing and built something. She would tell her that women in their family had understood, for generations, the difference between what you share and what is yours. She would tell her that there are moments in life when someone underestimates you so completely that it is almost a gift, because it shows you clearly who they are, and it leaves you exactly where you need to be. She would tell her that the land stays. The dinner dishes sat between them. Rosalie had fallen asleep on the blanket, one fist curled under her chin. The maple trees held the last of the light. Vivienne Okafor was 38 years old. She owned 40 acres. She had a daughter who already knew how to hold on. That was enough. That was more than enough. She was beginning to understand everything.